Hi, folks. I hope you can hear me now. And this is the very first time I'm actually going live on my own. Um, I normally am working with a producer and haven't really done YouTube Live uh, actually pretty much ever. Done Facebook Live and things like that. So I hope that you are all seeing me. If folks cannot kind of maybe even indicate just with a thumbs up that you are hearing and seeing me, that would be great. Just kind of need to know what's available, what's actually happening right now. So, hi, Paul. Hi, Pink Nickel Viz. Sure who that is. All right. I'm assuming that's Pamela, perhaps. All right, good. I'm glad you have a good connection. So, and by the way, I'm wearing a Ghostbuster shirt. Um, so I have a couple questions already. Pam, I think that's Pamela. Since there are people who witness paranormal precognitive examples, why do so many scientists still deny them? Well, there's several reasons. Number one, many scientists, especially materialist scientists, do not believe that the future is predictable, that anything can get information from the future. That's a problem, just in general. And even within physics, there's a question as to what the future actually is, or does it really even exist? Does time even exist? So there's that piece of it. Secondly, there's no mechanism from a physical perspective that we've been able to uncover as to how the information comes from a potential or current future, a set future. We tend not to think that the future is set in stone, but there's no mechanism for that information transfer into our brains and then into our consciousness. It's actually a multi-level problem, which we can actually point to quantum mechanics, since now it looks like, especially there's been more information coming out about supporting the idea that information can travel forwards and backwards in time. There's no like single arrow of time into the future at the quantum level. But the problem is that if information is transferred at the quantum level to us, number one, how does the information itself exist at that quantum level that relates to the macro world? Number two, if my brain receives it or my consciousness receives it, how does it bubble up through psychology? How do I become aware of it? And is that a biological process or something else? The quantum level is incredibly tiny, subatomic. So there's nothing we have as human beings other than perhaps an electron microscope to detect, to be able to see the quantum level, see atoms, for example. So it's a multi-level problem, and there's philosophical issues too. And of course, there's just way too many people in the mainstream that just simply say that ESP is impossible, regardless of what it is. So that's one piece of it. Pamela had also sent another question, and I'm going to kind of read this out. When a person, this is what's it called, when a person who knows someone else is in immediate danger or distress in real time instead of before the incident takes place. So real time, the thing is that within parapsychology, we look at informational transfer without the use of the normal senses or any sort of a technology or logical inference. We look at that as, first of all, ESP, extrasensory perception, or non-sensory perception. Senses relate to physical structures in the body. We don't know that there doesn't seem to be a structure for ESP. ESP can be information coming locally or from a long distance. That would be remote. Either real time, which has been known for the most part in parapsychological work as clairvoyance, even though mediums and others like to refer to the various forms of clairvoyance or the way that they receive the information, whether it's visual, auditory, and so on. We still call it clairvoyance. So technically, remote viewing, real-time remote viewing, is clairvoyance. Knowing with somebody in danger, that's clairvoyance. Although we might also refer to that simply as real-time psi, PSI, the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet, which refers to all ESP, in fact, refers to all psychic phenomena, psychic abilities. So we might call that real-time psi. And then if it's distance, you might call it remote viewing. But there's not like a special case for knowing when somebody's in danger. That would be kind of parsing it out a little bit too specifically for us. Non-local entangled consciousness. Non-local consciousness, non-local awareness is often used there. So non-local awareness is not an uncommon phrase used in consciousness um, discussions in general. And then there's anomalous cognition, which would fit all of ESP, which is knowing without knowing how we know. That would make it anomalous in that way. Quantum entanglement has not been proven in any way, shape, and form to scale up to the macro level. The problem with using the quantum metaphor is that the quantum level of reality works by very different laws of physics than the macro level that we live in. That's a problem. If our consciousness is some form of quantum field that scales up or provides information, works with the brain. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about the physics, the neurophysics, or the biological physics of the brain. Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose have a theory of quantum tubules, nanotubules. Actually, they're not quantum, they're nanotubules, very, very small carbon tubules which exist in the brain, and that's responsible for picking up the quantum information. But we don't have an understanding of how information would get onto that level, let alone come up. Again, scale up. So scale down and scale up. That's the problem. Quantum entanglement may be actually the explanation for everything, for all of this. It's entirely possible. But we're not at a point where we can say it is. And in reality, we've all been entangled since the formation of the planet, for that matter. I mean, technically, if you want to say that particles are entangled if they've been in contact in some point in their existence, yeah, we have been entangled, but it's not something we can directly address. And there's too much use of a quantum metaphor for describing ESP and even psychokinesis that really, I know that it bothers a lot of physicists in general. And in fact, it can be a reason why some of the physicists don't want to deal with psychic ability, including precognition, as mentioned earlier, because too many people, even within our field, instead of saying this is a metaphor, they will say this is the explanation. And we're not there yet. I think I've mentioned this before as past shows. My good buddy and colleague, Edwin C. May, who is the main author of the book ESP Wars, East and West, which I'm a co-author of, about the US and Soviet psychic spying programs, the Stargate program for the US. He was the program director from late fall 1985 till its closure in 1995. And he, as a nuclear physicist in training, that's where he was a nuclear physicist, and is still considered himself a physicist, even though he does parapsychology work. Ed sort of has he always has this kind of odd look if somebody says, I'm going to take a quantum leap in understanding something, because as he points out, and it's absolutely true, it's something I thought of reading science fiction books. And even before the TV show Quantum Leap came on TV, that a quantum leap would be the smallest leap you could possibly make, because quantum particles are not going to go very far typically for that. So Randy Liebeck, one of my colleagues, anomalous cognition might be the best label for this stuff, because we don't know what the mechanics are that are involved. And I totally agree with that. And I also have been really intrigued. I find Michael Talbot's book, folks, if you have not read a book called The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, he passed away a number of years ago. Pick that book up. It's still in print. It's an amazing book. And it talks, it's a very different look at the universe, and it actually could explain a lot of what we're talking about here. Pamela my children call it mom's downloads. Interesting. That's an interesting label. I think people have different names for all this stuff. Even remote viewing is kind of a misnomer, because the Russians, one of the things we discovered, Ed May and Joe McMonagle discovered in talking to the Russian counterparts, who they got to know pretty well in the early 90s after the Soviet Union fell. One of them was a General Alexei Savin, and then there was a couple of other former generals and actually all former KGB people too. And they provided material for our book, ESP Wars, East and West. So if you're interested in the politics of remote viewing and all that stuff, that's the book to go to. But one of the things that's kind of funny is that, funny and not funny, during the Chechenian conflict that the Russians were involved in with Chechnya, the Russian tanks, apparently most of the tanks had someone trained in remote viewing in each of the tanks. And the purpose was for that person who was psychically trained to be able to look ahead around the corner or down the street so that the tank would not be hit by a rocket, for example, a shoulder-fired rocket. And when Savin apparently mentioned that, around the corner to Ed May, in the same breath as he's talking about remote viewing, Ed basically kind of laughed and said, what do you consider, how is 40 feet remote? And this is something that I see every once in a while, that, words can be a little difficult, but somebody who is holding an envelope, and I've actually seen people do this or say this. I've heard them say this. They want to know, they're trying to psychically pick up what's in an envelope they're holding or is in front of them. So they're going to do remote viewing. Now, if it's a picture of a location and they're trying to view the location represented by the picture, that can be remote viewing. But if they're just trying to figure out what's in the envelope, that's not remote viewing, because there's nothing remote about that envelope. Remote viewing refers to a remote location or a remote target. It's all clairvoyance. So all, again, real-time psi, unless the individual is trying to determine where something is going to happen, or where someone's going to be, or what's happening at the location, even their own location, into the future. That might be considered remote viewing, but even then it should be a distance issue too. So that's it gets confusing. And in reality, remote viewing, the process itself is not just visual. This is kind of like the term clairvoyance, which is a catch-all for real-time ESP. Remote viewing is not just viewing. The remote viewers might pick up information from a location or from a target that is auditory to the way they process the information. It could be that they feel a temperature of the location. It could be that they get a smell or series of smells or other things. So it's not just viewing. It's really remote perception. Just like extrasensory perception is perception that is extra, above or beyond the senses. It's not a sixth sense. So we have actually other senses that we do use. Miles, does parapsychology look at psychic dreaming in a serious way, precognitive visitations from dead loved ones? Yes, actually, last year, I think it was, the 50th anniversary edition of the book Dream Telepathy came out. Stanley Krippner and Montague Ullman. If this was a study done at Maimonides Medical Center in the 70s, it's an absolutely amazing, really, really scientific study of dream telepathy. And it, in some respects, it kind of kickstarted this kind of subset within the field of parapsychology. But there's definitely been studies of this. And in fact, I wrote a book, which I will pull down from my shelf here, called Psychic Dreaming. So still in print, that covers a lot of the research and also covers kind of people's experiences in this. And psychic dreams can be, yes, visitations. They can be precognitive. They can be telepathic, kind of mutual dreaming. There are other books. There's a book out there called Mutual Dreaming. I can't recall who the author is of that. Robert Vandekast has written about psychic dreams, as have a number of other folks within the field. So this is not, it's absolutely a piece of it. And even the International Association for the Study of Dreams has talked about this kind of subject as well. Which of the books you've written are you most proud of? Wow. That's a really interesting question. That's a tough thing to ask, or to say rather, to kind of address. There's a couple of them. I think that my book, Mind Over Matter, which is unfortunately currently out of print, I'm going to bring it back into the print next, before the end of the first half of the year. Mind Over Matter, absolutely, very proud of that book. I am very proud of my first book, ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists. I'm especially given the impact it's had, especially on amateur and hobbyist ghost hunters over the years. And frankly, I love my book, A Paranormal Casebook, which I put out in the second edition last year. In fact, in putting that back together for a second edition, I decided, as I was deciding whether to include any new cases in it, I realized I have a lot that I could write up, and I like to write up unique cases, not just what's to me are the average everyday cases. And so I'm going to do another edition, another volume of A Paranormal Casebook towards the end of the year. So the first one is the subtitle currently, it's a different subtitle than when it was originally released. The subtitle is Cases from a Parapsychologist for 25 or so years. The second volume will be Cases from a Parapsychologist first, I'm going to probably say like 45 or so years, something like that. So definitely play around with that. ESP Hauntings and Poltergeists is in print currently. And Paul, thank you. It first came out in 1986. And just to give you a little backstory, the reason that book was even written, although I had wanted to write something for some time, the reason it got published is an interesting story in itself, in that this is during the time when we actually had a graduate parapsychology program at JFK University, which ran from 1977 to about 1987. And in 1984, which is a key date in the history of cinema, late May of 1984, a movie came out called Ghostbusters. You can see there's my Ghostbusters logo. And this is, back in the 80s and even into the 90s, a movie could stay in the theaters for months. Ghostbusters actually stayed in some theaters until October of 84. But it did incredibly well. It was an incredibly well-received, high-grossing film. And we had a couple of local news stations did segments on us in June of 84 and July. A couple local things came up. But then I got a call at the parapsychology department, since I was handling media requests as well as teaching. And it was from a local, an Oakland Tribune reporter who wanted to do a profile on the real life Ghostbusters, because that's what we were. We were the only graduate program in the United States. And the Oakland Trib wanted to do a story on us. So she had a particular schedule in mind for doing the interviews, for following us around. And as it turned out, good or bad for me, it was the dates that fell, her dates fell when the Parapsychological Association convention, the annual convention, was being held. And it was being held in Dallas. And everyone on the faculty was going except me. So what ended up happening was she came and interviewed me. And I also put her in touch with Dr. Carlos Sosis, who is the research director at the American Society for Psychical Research. So she talked to him a bit too, because I had worked a little bit with him before I came back to JFK after grad school. And the story appeared the beginning of September 1984. To my surprise, it was a front page of the lifestyle, the living section of the Oakland Trib. So it was most of it was a picture of me, a big spread, and it went to the second page. Huge thing. There's some quotes from Osis as well. It was picked up because of Ghostbusters. It was picked up by the Associated Press, and therefore ran in newspapers all over the country. In fact, it ran in a tabloid, the National Star at the time. Over the next couple of months through the end of October, we figured, based on what I was able to find out, it ran in over 500 newspapers. I was able to collect some of the clips and some of the other things as well. We were inundated in September once this article hit the newspapers around the country, and especially in October, by reporters, by radio stations. There were no podcasts at that time. And a lot of requests came to me. That October, I ended up doing a bunch of TV shows, including some national shows. I ended up doing 250 radio interviews of anywhere from 4 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the show. The shorter ones were like rock and roll stations, drive time stations, country stations. Just they wanted to do a quick thing. Generally, it was in October. we actually had another 100 or so interviews done by the other faculty members as well. So in the meantime, one of my students, one of our graduate students, her ex-boyfriend was a literary agent. I did not know this. Late in the fall, after October 31st, after Halloween, she says, "Do you want to talk to my ex? He has already done some research and talked to publishers for you because I knew you wanted to write a book." And when I spoke to him, Patrick O'Heffernan was his name. He said, "Okay, we have several publishers interested. Let me tell you about the book you're going to write." And that led to ESP Hauntings and Poltergeist, although that was not the original title. All right, back over here. Randy, thank you very much. I tried to make it useful. I mean, having taught, as someone who was teaching graduate school, I really tried to make it as useful as possible for people. Not just interesting, but also useful in many respects. I was very fortunate to have an editor named Brian Thompson, who was the science fiction editor for Warner Books. And he was great to work with. He actually gave me some really, really great guidance in terms of shifting things around in the book, and even helped with some of the sci-fi stuff that I covered in the book as well. So he was a really, really big help for that book. It was kind of an interesting kind of launch. It was supposed to launch originally in 1985, but Warner didn't have missed their deadline or something. Something happened with the deadline, because I got the book in on plenty of time, but they had other things on their schedule already, so they pushed it back. Instead of the beginning of '86, they pushed it back to October of '86, of course, because they wanted to get it out of Halloween. But that led to a lot of publicity. So, Paul, that book got you interested in. I'm glad to see. I mean, I know a lot of people said that book got them interested in parapsychology. I'm really glad that happened. I mean, I feel like I made my mark in the field, at least for the general public in that way. But there were so many people who had books out who, like Scott Rogo, D. Scott Rogo, who was one of my instructors and actually knew a little bit before he was murdered in 1990. And his books are, some of which have been reprinted, by the way. So I encourage you to go out and get his books as well. I wrote for the general public, specifically. Scott did too. Scott was incredibly knowledgeable about the history of parapsychology and journals and things like that, and had been an investigator also. So definitely encourage you to pick up his books. Okay, Lucas, you're probably going to ask this kind of question before. What kind of evidence would you present to a genuine, open-minded skeptic who says, "I don't believe in ghosts"? Well, if they're open-minded skeptic, they would pretty much, they should be saying, "I don't care," or "I don't know if ghosts exist or not." If they say, "I don't believe in ghosts," that leans me to say that they're probably not an open-minded skeptic. But when it comes right down to it, we look at a ghost or an apparition as a conscious entity, or the consciousness of a human being that has survived the death of the body and is capable of interacting with the regular physical world, with the rest of us. In fact, that apparition hasn't moved on to whatever the other side is, different than what mediums talk to typically. So we're in a problem. We've got a problem here. I mean, I can provide, and we have provided skeptics, even within the field of parapsychology, by the way. We have skeptics about this, but we can provide as much information with commonalities and patterns of people's experiences, with people having communication with spirit, with apparitions, providing information they could not possibly have known, just one thing after another, and it wouldn't necessarily convince anybody unless they truly were open-minded and also considered that we can't prove this in any way, shape, or form, because the very basic definition of an apparition, consciousness, is also not defined within science. This is the hard question of science, as David Chalmers has said. It is being looked at from different angles from people in all fields of science, and nobody agrees as to what consciousness is. So it's a very, very difficult question. So when somebody says, "I don't believe in ghosts," what's your proof? I don't have to give proof. It's like, what's your proof of consciousness? We have an assumption. that consciousness exists. So there we are. Skeptic Chris French. Yeah, Chris French, although he's grudgingly admitted that parapsychology is a science and we follow the scientific method and all of that, but he he is more of the disbelieving side. He is skeptical on the leaning towards he's not a pseudo skeptic because he doesn't dismiss things out of turn. He actually looks at things, but his interpretation puts him in the non-survival category. So that's an important thing to know. And again, within the field of parapsychology, we have some people who are materialists, and they would look at the evidence for apparitions, for ghosts, as evidence for ESP, and they might have other explanations for each of the different individual experiences, which is often called super ESP or super psi in parapsychology, and just frankly, is not a simpler explanation. So it just really depends on who you are and your personal philosophy. If you're a materialist, there is nothing we can say that's going to say that consciousness exists without a body, because that is not materialism in that sense, until we understand the physics of consciousness in that way. Pam, the transference of knowledge without normal senses being involved seems to be continuing great debate. Yeah, that is what ESP is. It is what's really interesting is that science has changed in terms of the way it looks at our field. Back in the 40s and 50s especially, extrasensory perception was more acceptable to people. I don't know about psychokinesis, but definitely ESP was. The American College of Mathematicians looked at the data coming out of the then Duke Parapsychology Laboratory, which is now the Rhine Research Center, and did the statistics just to check J.B. Rhine's statistics, and basically said, if the data is accurate, ESP exists, no question. So a lot of scientists, a lot of people actually accepted ESP as something starting around the 1970s. And I think it was partly a blowback to all the freaky stuff that was coming out and publishing on the occult and conflating that with parapsychology, and Atlantis and conflating that with parapsychology, and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and the Bermuda Triangle was all lumped together with parapsychology. And I think a lot of folks just kind of backed away because of all that, the other attachments. But then the actual skeptics movement started with the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, and they did a hatchet job on our field, basically, with academia here in the United States, making it uncomfortable for even academics, for scientists to even admit that they had a personal belief in the subject. So we've had a social problem, not necessarily a science problem in that way. Paul, you read Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism and Consciousness Unbound. Yeah, Ed Kelly, who's been around the field since the 70s, I think it was. He did work at the Institute for Parapsychology, which was the organization founded after J.B. Rhine moved when he retired from Duke University and moved off campus. Ed's a brilliant thinker, no question about it. Actually, I remember talking to him in the early 80s and talking about his engineering background as well. But he's a brilliant thinker. Those are amazing books, but they're very dense and deep, a lot of deep thinking. All right, Mu Super Psi is a conspiracy level of explanation. I wouldn't call it a conspiracy because the folks, conspiracies people sometimes truly believe. I would say, yeah, God, that's a really interesting way of putting it. I'm having lunch with Ed May next week. I'm going to throw that at him and see what he thinks about that. There is nothing about super psi that's been demonstrated in the lab. The thing that really kind of gets me sometimes is that there's no, other than using that as an explanation, and basically for everybody who doesn't know, super psi is a term that says that ESP may have no upper limits in some instances. But it's really interesting that people will use super psi, for example, to describe what's happening in a case of a child who remembers a previous life. And there's so much detail, and the researchers at the University of Virginia can track down the previous personality and verify things and clearly show that kid and that kid's family could not possibly have known any of that stuff. And they'll use super psi. Some will use super psi. Some will actually say super psi doesn't even fit here. We don't know what this is. But those that say super psi, it's like those kids have no psychic ability otherwise, with the rarest of exception. There's no other demonstration of ESP, and it's very singular. They're only remembering one previous life. So that makes no sense at all. Super psi working the way it's been described in so many ways, so many different instances, when the people having those experiences or involved in this don't have other experiences of psi, again, makes very little sense. So I have a hard time with that one. But there's a philosophical starting point. If you're a materialist, you're not going to go with anything else. Let's see. Federico Fagan, who worked with Ed Kelly, new book Irreducible, also good read. Let's see. Different Ed Kelly from the one who's radionics expert. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the reincarnation cases, when somebody says super psi, I just have to roll my eyes pretty much for that. Okay, I did have another question that was sent to me in advance by someone up in Scotland who is not with us live. I know that. And his question is, and it's a kind of interesting question, if you had $1 million in funding for whatever parapsychology research project you wanted to pursue, what would you do with it? Well, there's two ways I might approach that. Number one, I'd take a very small portion of it, because it wouldn't cost very much, to do an experiment to look at the connection of the geomagnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field, with a haunting experience. I've had this idea for a long time because Michael Persinger, who did the basic research with others back in the 80s and 90s and until his death, connecting changes in the Earth's magnetic field to certain types of psychic experiences. And he created a helmet often called the God helmet, because it can generate mystical experiences for people. But this was at Laurentian University in Canada, and the helmet would mimic the Earth's magnetic field changes. The field, by the way, is not very strong. It's actually not as strong, for example, as what's given off by a microwave or a TV set or computer, things like that. But depending on how the field shifted and how it hits your brain, the angle, apparently it caused different experiences for people. But doing it in the laboratory, if someone suddenly had an apparition experience or some similar kind of experience with the helmet on, there wasn't any verifiable information that came through, which you would find in hauntings and in apparition cases. So it'd be interesting to take a portable version. There are consumer versions of the helmet called the Shakti helmet, different versions. Take a portable version and do an experiment in a haunted place and non-haunted places. You could do with battlefields on the East Coast, things like that, like Gettysburg and other, but you'd have to make sure that the individual with the helmet on did not know whether the place was haunted or not. And see if they do have experiences, and are those experiences verifiable? Do they provide verifiable information? And if so, it just kind of indicates that kind of real connection between geomagnetic fields and hauntings. That's a small portion, because really you talk about travel and minimal experiments otherwise. So most of it, I think I'd want to use to digitize every bit of literature in parapsychology, from even some of the literature that came before the Society for Psychical Research got founded. So digitize that. There are journals, there are other things, and some of it's being digitized very slowly, but there's papers from conferences. Put it all in, digitize it, have a large language model built, and use AI, a large language model, AI, and maybe agentic AI, which does learn from what it's doing, to look for patterns, but to come up with hypotheses and potential experiments, suggested experiments to try to find the commonalities, to kind of look for everything. And it would not just be experimental stuff. It would be also all the anecdotal reports. In some respects, Louisa Ryan, who went through over 20,000 letters with people's experiences. So she was looking at spontaneous psychic experiences. She was sort of doing that, but it's not always that easy. It'd be easier to have that kind of experiment done, or that setup done. That's what I would do. Now, the AI output, you'd have to be careful about, because generative AI does try to please the questioner. And you always have to take that with a grain of salt. So, but when it's limited and based on a specific set of literature instead of the open web and other things, you can have it cite specifics as to where the information came from, what's the answer based on, and that will help quite a bit. The guide rails will help quite a bit with that. So that's my answer to that question. Okay, Pamela, my son, 50-year-old mathematician, attended a lecture last week with California Institute of Consciousness in San Francisco, Joshua Bach. Attendees argued about AI. Oh, interesting. I'd love to know what the argument was. Probably about whether AI is conscious at that, or whether it's going to be conscious. That's always the worry, that it'll be conscious and not like us. I think that everybody's worried about Skynet. If that doesn't sound familiar, go watch The Terminator. Okay. Yeah, Persinger definitely became a believer. There's no question about it. I mean, he saw too much evidence for things. You're rewatching Constantine. I assume you're rewatching the Constantine is that the movie or is it a TV show? Because the Constantine TV show with Matt Ryan was so close to, not perfect, but close to the comic book. And I actually, when they released it on Blu-ray, I picked it up. It was a one season hit on NBC. It wasn't even a hit. If you have any interest in like occult detectives and stuff like that, you definitely got to get that. The movie with Keanu Reeves, it was okay. He really wasn't Constantine, at least not based on the comics. He got retrieves a hospital wristband. Would the wristband be considered an apport? I don't think so, because he brought it back himself. If he grabs something physical and brings it back, so an apport has to appear. So unless Constantine, the Constantine character, like was not physically there and dropped it in somebody's hand, that wouldn't be considered an apport. Yeah, Stuart Hameroff, I think, and Roger Penrose both, but Hameroff especially is kind of, to me, a leading thinker in the developing field of consciousness studies and consciousness research, looking at the question of what consciousness is. And I think that he's been around for quite some time. And we knew of him back even in the JFK days at that point. Okay, the movie with Keanu. Yeah, I keep hearing they're making a Constantine 2 with Keanu. And I like Keanu Reeves. It's just that he wasn't Constantine, not the character. If you watch the TV show, the Constantine TV show, it's really clear that the two characters are very different. And Matt Ryan's Constantine, who was also the character on Legends of Tomorrow, the CW show, he embodies the character from the comic books. A parapsychologist studied cultural shamanism around the world and studied psi experience, the use of substances. Yes, we have a subfield called Paranthropology. In fact, there's even a journal it's more of a magazine called Paranthropology, put out by Jack Hunter, irregularly put out, but there are many issues that are available free on both the Internet Archive, and I think there's even a Paranthropology Facebook page that has references to stuff. Jack Hunter, who's an anthropologist, has written several, actually edited or written books connecting parapsychology and these belief systems and psychic ability and all that to magical beliefs, supernatural beliefs around the world. In fact, that was my undergraduate. That focus was my undergrad. And there are also some other books specifically about parapsychology and anthropology that have been put together within our field. So unfortunately out of print, but there is quite a bit of information there. So yeah, it is. And I teach a course. I'm not sure when I'm next teaching it. I don't think it might be next fall. I'm not sure when I'm next doing it. Or maybe even this spring. We haven't really talked about what I'm teaching this spring, I don't think. For the Ryan Research Center, it's the Ryan Education Center, which is listed. If you go to the description of the channel, you can see it. But here is, see on this website, if you look through all the courses, you'll see there's one on paranthropology. In fact, um, it's a favorite topic of mine. I mean, I've had interest in different cultures, and I was very, very lucky when I switched into an cultural anthropology major at Northwestern in my sophomore year, because I started out in astrophysics, believe it or not. Um, and I was assigned an advisor in the anthro department, and I walked into Dr. Chris Bohm's office and saw some journals, some copies of the Journal of Parapsychology on his shelf. That was was a sign from the universe that I had done the right thing. Let's put it that way. Okay, are you a fan of Deadpool and Wolverine? I did see the movie. I really liked it. It was a lot of fun. I am a full fan more of the Deadpool movies than I am of the Wolverine movies. I will say that. Really love Deadpool, and I really kind of like Ryan Reynolds' sense of humor quite a bit. I actually, although the ending sucked, really, um, I own a copy of the extended version of the Green Lantern movie where he was Green Lantern. It was Hal Jordan. So yeah, I've watched it a couple times. Um, I still can't believe they had Keanu playing the Buddha in Little Buddha. Yeah. Keanu Reeves, if you've seen any of the stuff on social media about him, he pops up in various places. He seems like a hell of a nice guy. He's been really very kind to people and doesn't seem like your normal Hollywood kind of guy. Pamela, let's see. My older grandchild liked the movie Sixth Sense way back when they were children. Yeah. So The Sixth Sense is a great movie, as a mystery especially. I didn't get that Bruce Willis was dead until towards the very end. I thought that was. I hope people have not. If people have not seen it, I'm sure I should have said spoiler ahead. Um, it's a great movie. I mean, it really is a very good movie. Now, a week after that movie came out, another movie came out, which unfortunately got lost in the shuffle because of the Sixth Sense popularity, because of that big, reveal at the end. And that movie is called simply Stir of Echoes. It's based on a book by Richard Matheson, who had an incredible knowledge of parapsychology. Did change the story and the plot a little bit, but it's a really excellent film with Kevin Bacon. So you can probably find that on Tubi or one of the other free streaming services pretty easily. Definitely see that. Now, there was a sequel made for TV called Stir of Echoes 2, which didn't do it for me. But Stir of Echoes should have gotten a lot more play than it did, and it didn't because it came out a week after The Sixth Sense. Would have been interesting if it came out a week before. Hameroff's microtubules theory might explain consciousness interaction with the body, like stigmata forming by hypnosis or reincarnation. Yeah, it's the mind-body thing. The big question really is, what's the mechanism for information? What's the mechanism for interaction too? Because psychokinesis happens without physically touching things. So there's something else going on where consciousness can interact with the physical world for information or otherwise in different ways. Microtubules in the skeleton of cells and cells in the body. I think that's where Hameroff's got started with that. Yeah. Fun film. I assume, yes, Stir of Echoes. Stir of Echoes is a lot of fun. It's a sort of a murder mystery in some respects, but definitely worth watching. And I highly encourage reading the book. Matheson's books, just generally, always had a ring of truth. Even the Legend of Hell House book, which is simply called Hell House. He wrote the book Hell House as an homage to Shirley Jackson's book, The Haunting of Hill House, which became the 1963 movie, The Haunting, one of the best movies, haunted house movies ever made, with only one special effect, which you'll figure out in the thing. Really well done. Legend of Hell House, the film, he wrote the script for that too. Also a good movie. Not as good as The Haunting, but it's also a good movie. But Matheson wrote a lot of, he's written horror, he's written science fiction. He wrote a large number of the original Twilight Zone episodes. My colleague Barry Taff knew him well and talked about the best library on parapsychology he'd ever seen. There's a book he put out in is kind of a limited edition, which I have a copy of, but so I have an autographed copy, but it's on Amazon as a Kindle book called Mediums Rare, and it's about the history of mediumship. It's not a long book, but he wrote a bunch of haunting type books, and also wrote a book, some other really kind of cool books as well. That he wrote, What Dreams May Come, which became a great movie. He wrote the book Somewhere in Time, which was that kind of romantic time travel movie with Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour. So he was a very widely, and he wrote cross genres quite a bit. The butterfly effect. Oh, I don't know if you're referring to the film. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting film, and of course there's other stories and things that refer to the butterfly effect. That comes from a science fiction story. Um, I think it was Gun for Dinosaur was the story by Ray Bradbury back in the golden age of science fiction. There was also another one called Sound of Thunder, which I think was by L. Sprague de Camp. But the time travel folks, somebody stepped on a butterfly after tourists traveling back in time. They stepped off the path, stepped on a butterfly, and when they got back to the future, it had been completely changed for that. Pamela, really enjoyed. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed that interview with Jimmy Akin. I'm going to be putting up links to the Hornets shows that Jimmy Akin did, and just released actually the two USS Hornet shows. One of which was with an interview with me. The other was with some video that I had supplied from interviews we had done at the Hornet years ago. And my media page on LloydAuerbach.com, I've got to update sometime this week with another 10 more recent podcasts that I've done, and I'll definitely include Jimmy's there as well. And if you haven't paid attention to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, it's a great podcast, and Jimmy's a really deep thinker and a great researcher. And in fact, we brought him on as one of our instructors for the Rhine Education Center. So always good to have him with us. Paul used to practice Ayurveda and Qigong. Deepak Chopra book, Ageless Body, Timeless Mind. You read that book? Okay. Yeah, I mean, Deepak Chopra, there's some things about his philosophy that's really interesting, but some things seem like they're more pop psychology than anything else. So not have a deep stuff there. Are you familiar with? Yes, I am familiar with William Bengston's healing method and research. I mean, I know it's done very carefully. Bengston has done work with the Rhine as well. So I know he's very careful. There's been other healing research that has been also very, very careful. You have to kind of consider what the effect is long term, and also the immediate, and how much of that is psychic. In some respects, you can say the placebo effect, which is often used as the explanation for psychic healing and things like that, is in fact a mind-body effect. If there's a physical effect in the body, that's a form of psychokinesis. So, but Bengston's work is very, very good. It's absolutely it's being researched by a form that's being researched by John Kruth at the Rhine Research Center as well. Caitlin, glad you like Jimmy's Intro to Parapsychology. Yes, Paul, I have listened to Alex Tsakiris. It's not recently. I did an episode with him. I don't know, something like 8 years ago, talking about the Stargate program. He is a good interviewer. He's a very good interviewer. And even though it's called, Skeptico, I think he's skeptical in the best way possible in general. And definitely worth another show that's worth taking a look at or listen to. All right, what do you think of idealist philosophy? Idealism is not always panpsychism, which says that everything is conscious. But idealism has, the impact of consciousness has an impact directly on everything. And I think we have to kind of realistically look at various forms of philosophy and perspective, and somewhere in the middle. I mean, if we drew a Venn diagram and looked at all the things that kind of overlap, that's probably where it is, where the truth is. And we probably philosophies that have not been created yet. I guess we need idealism to come up with new philosophies. I think that we're still missing things. You know, to assume that we can figure everything out right now because our state of science and technology is such as it is fairly naive. We are missing still information about, things to know about consciousness, things to know about our brains, for that matter. We don't know everything about the brain. We don't know everything about physics. We're missing pieces still. We're not at the level to answer all the questions we want to answer right now. And in fact, it's possible that some science fiction writer has already answered those questions in some of their novels or some stories somewhere, because imagination gets us there in some respects. But I don't think everything is conscious. I don't have I mean, technically, if PK exists, everything could react to consciousness. But when physicists even talk about the universe, that consciousness is connected to the universe, they're not talking about human consciousness, nor are they talking necessarily about thought, the way we think. They're talking about something else. So it's important. Again, this is where the definitions kind of get a little weird. I think a form of dualism does make more sense to me as well. And I guess it really depends on how you define what it is to be conscious. If that's self-awareness, then I definitely think that idealism is not right. Because I don't think my computer, I mean, the physical computer, the laptop, is not necessarily self-aware. Maybe its programming is, but I don't think we're dealing with the same kind of awareness here. Let's see here. Are there cases that are known where someone has a premonition about something and was able to stop? Yes. Although not necessarily a major tragic event. For example, there were a number of people who did have precognitive experiences around 9/11. In fact, I talked to a pilot who, even though it wasn't a conscious experience, he was supposed to be on flight 93. It was somebody I had actually talked to about a few years before who had had an apparition experience. He's a friend of a friend. And he called me after 9/11 because he was now seeing a psychologist for survivor guilt, because he was supposed to be on flight 93 and didn't feel right that morning. He just like, I don't think I should go. He had a premonition. He didn't go. So he changed his personal future. He didn't change the plane crashing in that way, the hijacking and all that. There have been experiences that people have reported where they've changed their own personal future, where they saw themselves getting into an accident or saw themselves and their friends getting into an accident. In my psychic dreaming book, there's a bunch of examples of what people might consider mundane experiences that are very, very warning related. And they avoided some things that they were dreaming about. But we have something in parapsychology called the intervention paradox, that if I get a warning about some tragedy that an accident I'm going to get into, and I get enough information to avoid that, and I avoid it, and I don't get into an accident, did I imagine that? Did I really get information from the future? Because it didn't happen. I intervened. And you can take a step further and say, you stopped short at a light because for whatever reason, you knew that if you went through that green light, someone's going to run the red light from the side, and you have blind corners. You can't see anything. And you got music blaring in your car. You can't hear anything. But you knew that you should stop and pull over. So some guy pulls ahead of you and goes into the intersection and gets just hit, T-boned by somebody who ran a red light. You avoided your tragedy. Someone else had the tragedy. So it actually did happen. It just didn't happen to you. But we can't, for example, avoid an earthquake. We can get out of the way of the earthquake. We can leave if there's a tsunami coming, but we can't actually change that event. It's a natural event. So we can change things where humans are involved, tougher otherwise to do anything else. And again, we call that the intervention paradox. It does seem to indicate the future is probabilistic rather than definitive. Let's see. Jeffrey Mishlove is raising funds for. Yeah, I actually heard about the documentary on the PK Man, Ted Owens. I'm really looking forward to seeing that. For those of you who don't know, Ted Owens could do things like apparently affect the weather. He had a lot of PK ability, but it's worth reading Jeffrey Mishlove's book, The PK Man, to learn all about Ted Owens, in fact. New Thinking Aloud is Jeffrey's YouTube show. He interviews some top thinkers in philosophy and physics and consciousness and parapsychology. It's a really important show, and if you're not familiar with it, take a look. Just there is a New Thinking Aloud channel, and definitely worth looking at. All right, we're coming down. We got about 4 minutes left. Seth MacFarlane said he was supposed to be on the flight on 9/11. He said it was just a coincidence. It depends on why he wasn't on that flight. You know, there was a study back in the 1950s and early 60s looking at train crashes, train disasters, when even if it was some that wasn't really terribly tragic. And they looked at the capacity of, specifically at ones that had gone through, the route was commuter time, so morning and evening, before and after work. So they knew the ridership, the numbers of riders that you normally have. And they found that on those occasions when the train was in an accident, the ridership was significant, like not even a little bit, it was significantly down. You know, we heard about Flight 93 being, and some of these other planes, not having a lot of people on the planes. And that's been used as like conspiracy theory. But based on what we know in parapsychology, I think you'd have to interview everyone who might have had a ticket and decided to change their flight for whatever reason in both those circumstances. Now, the problem with intervening is sometimes not having enough information. So there's a famous case with a man named David Booth back in the late 1970s, who was a computer salesman, and he had a recurring dream about a jumbo jet crashing at O'Hare in the evening. He could see the weather conditions. He could see what, darkness there. He could see that it was filled to capacity. He could see what kind of aircraft it was. He could see what runway it was going to hit on. He didn't know what day. He didn't know what airline or flight number. He called the FAA. Actually, in the 1980s, I was able to speak to someone at the FAA through an NBC News person I knew, a guy named Jack Barker, who actually had spoken to David Booth. And the FAA took him very seriously because in his dream, he saw the problem in the avionics in the aircraft. They took him seriously. Now, they did not know when, Booth got the feeling it's going to happen soon, like within a few weeks. But you can't ground all the planes, even if you do know the fault, because this particular problem with the avionics was deep inside the aircraft and would have required taking each aircraft out of service for about 24 hours. And without knowing the airline and without knowing the aircraft, the flight number would have helped, of course, but the airline would have been at least that. They could not ground so many flights that required the jump that already had been ticketed and all that. They just didn't know, especially since they don't know what day. It was what day they could have done something, just couldn't do anything. And this actually happened. The event actually happened. And from what Barker knew, Booth ended up, again, going to therapy for survivor's guilt. I mean, there was nothing he could have done other than what he did. But sometimes ESP, psychic information is often piecemeal. Okay, so we are now at the hour. I'm going to, we'll be back actually with the regular, really nice kind of setup on the screen. This time you can see a lot more of my home office here. And my producer will be back in 2 weeks. I'll be back in 2 weeks on March 16th. In the meantime, if you have any questions you'd like me to address, probably depending on when I get them, I might even address them on email, but I'll bring them up also in the show. Please send an email to me at askprofparanormal@gmail.com. Again, you can see the link to my email is in the description of the channel itself, as are links to organizations you might want to look into. And in the description of this particular episode, you will see a link to something on Hightail. It is basically a document download with some resource documents you can get for free. The link is there, as well as the passcode for that. So feel free to take a look at those, and feel free to contact me if you have anything. In the meantime, take care, everybody, and have a great couple of weeks.